Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 on the 19th of April. I'm Maggie Lennon and here are the up-to-date coronavirus statistics. As of 2 o'clock today, a total of 1,885,607 people in Scotland have been tested through NHS Scotland labs and UK government regional testing centres since the start of the pandemic. Of these, 1,661,515 have been confirmed negative and 224,092 have tested positive. There are 178 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test, although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms and not all those with symptoms will be tested. There are sadly 2 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus COVID-19 infection now stands at 7,644. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 106 were still in hospital last night, 13 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 o'clock this morning, 2,750,052 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination and 797,267 had received their second dose. The latest UK daily figures show 127,307 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have died from their illness, an increase across the UK of 33. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just in hospitals. I'm joined this evening, admittedly a couple of minutes later than we'd hoped, by actor Julie Coombe and SNP original list candidate Emma Roddick. The technology gremlins were out and we had a little bit of problem connecting, but here we are. My autocue's also disappeared, so we'll just see how it goes tonight, shall we? These statistics, getting better. How are you all feeling about the fact that things are about to open up? Either of you?
Who?
Julie?
Oh, I don't know. Fairly excited actually. Although I did kind of get it a bit mixed up today. Got it a bit mixed up. I said earlier to Linda when I was talking about coming on to the show, I'm going to go and get my eyebrows done because I haven't had my eyebrows done for a long time, and they're not open till next Monday. So, but no, I think it is good. I think we have to be a bit cautious. I know I've got friends that I go walking with, and we're delighted that we can meet up again. But they were sort of saying, "Oh, we do need to be cautious because the government are saying that it's actually the lockdown that's driven down the figures rather than the vaccinations." But I think we have to err on the side of caution because we're getting it right in so many ways. But
Well, the
yeah.
caution has kind of been the main message really from the First Minister. Today, obviously, she did confirm that things are going to open up. So just to quickly run through the changes in the restrictions for people who may have missed the announcement at lunchtime today. So from Monday, the 26th of April, hospitality venues such as cafes, pubs and restaurants can reopen, along with tourist accommodation, and non-essential retail outlets and close contact services such as beauty salons, so you can get your eyebrows done, can also reopen, in addition to indoor attractions and public buildings such as galleries, museums and libraries. The First Minister confirmed that all parts of the country will move to level 3 from Monday the 26th of April. The remaining travel restrictions within Scotland will be lifted and travel across the UK will be permitted for any purpose. If everyone continues to follow the rules, the First Minister has said it's expected that all of Scotland will move to level 2 on Monday the 17th of May. Further changes from Monday include adults on the shielding list can return to the workplace if they cannot work from home, while children who've been shielding can return to school. Non-essential work inside people's homes, such as painting, decorating or repairing, will be permitted, subject to mitigations, and non-essential informal childcare will resume. Driving lessons and tests can take place, while gyms and swimming pools can reopen for individual exercise. The attendance limit for funerals and weddings and related events such as receptions will increase to 50. Cafes, pubs and restaurants can resume full outdoor service subject to local licensing and serve food indoors without alcohol until 8 p.m. Takeaways to resume normal service with physical distance and face masks in premises. The First Minister also announced that the rapid coronavirus tests will be made available to anyone in Scotland and to those planning to travel to the islands. So from today, anyone planning to travel to the islands next week can order a free home test kit online. The first test should be taken 3 days before travel and the second on the day of departure. And from Monday, lateral flow home test kits will be available to anyone in the wider population who does not have COVID-19 symptoms. They can be picked up from local walk or drive-through test sites for people to test themselves twice weekly. Anyone in Scotland who develops COVID-19 symptoms should self-isolate and book a PCR test. The expansion is aimed at finding cases that would otherwise go undetected so these people can self-isolate and avoid transmitting the virus to those around them. Because, Emma, it's right that it hasn't gone away, and the worrying thing is that some of the new variants, people are not showing any symptoms, so they don't know whether they've got it or not, and they could be spreading it more easily. How are things in Highland at the moment in terms of how people are feeling about tourists, for example, coming back up into the region?
It's absolutely mixed as you would expect because there are so many people and businesses in this region which rely very heavily on tourism. So obviously we want to be able to welcome tourists back, but there's still that fear that tourists might be bringing in, as you say, new variants. I was actually holding a virtual meeting in Orkney with our candidate up there, Robert Leslie, and it was something that people had brought up with us was the possibility of lateral flow tests for people who are visiting the island. So I think it's going to be really reassuring to those communities that we are going to be offering those. And I think for those of us who have been following the rules, the restrictions being relaxed on Monday is just really exciting. You know, I think exciting was said before, and that's how I'm feeling. I've already booked my gym session for 5:45 on Monday morning.
Yeah, well, the other thing, of course, that is not yet been any decisions made is international travel. Real concerns about the strain that's coming in from India. India's now been added to the red list. Universities across the UK are up in high do about it. 10,000 Indian students won't be able to come. So what is your view, Emma, on what should happen about international travel?
Well, I think yeah, we it has to be caution, and that's going to be difficult for people who are perhaps living apart from their families, not being able to continue with the study and work that they'd planned this year. But at the end of the day, you know, this virus has infected a lot of people. We've lost a lot of people, and caution is absolutely the right way to approach this.
Apart from getting your eyebrows done, Julie, are you planning any jaunts overseas anytime this year?
No, we're very much erring on the side of caution. I mean, obviously, our industry has been completely, well, pretty much obliterated, actually. And my husband is directing a show that we've both written, and it should have been out. It should have been two tours out last year. And it's been shunted sort of forward and forward and forward and forward. So it's now scheduled to go into rehearsal on the 27th of August, I think. But he's recently had confirmation of that. And he was saying, oh, great, it's come. And I think that we, you know, we want everybody to be as careful as we are because we want those theatres open again. We want back out there working. So that's kind of our big excitement. And my son should be graduating in the summer, but I don't think he'll be graduating. But, you know, life moves on in little ways. But really, it's so important for us to get back to work at the moment. So everybody behave so we can get the theatres open,
Yeah,
please.
absolutely. Everyone behaves so we can get the theatres open. I absolutely endorse that. The next big thing happening, of course, is the election. And I was just wondering, will these changes make any difference to campaigning rules, Emma?
Well, we've seen campaigning rules be relaxed already to the point that we are allowed to knock doors already. Personally, locally, we've decided against that. But undoubtedly, over the next week, people will be allowed to meet in larger groups to go leafleting and canvassing. I would again say I really hope that everybody is being cautious and we're not putting anybody at risk just for the sake of some leaflets.
Absolutely. In a speech to the STUC broadcast today, Nicola Sturgeon said that the pandemic had shone a light on the fragilities in our society and pledged to use the devolved powers to improve working practices in Scotland where possible. Key pledges outlined by the First Minister included reviewing and expanding the Scottish Government's Fair Work First programme to include, for example, more flexible and family-friendly working practices, and also to clamp down on fire and rehire tactics. Support a specific accreditation programme for living hours, similar to the accreditation currently given to living wage employers. Establish a £10 million fund to supporting companies in piloting and exploring the benefits of a 4-day working week, with a view to more general shift once the Scottish Parliament has the powers to do so. Supporting working families, particularly those on low incomes, by building a system of wraparound childcare, doubling the Scottish Child Payment and beginning work on a minimum income guarantee. Creating a national care service, a key election ask of the STUC, which, as well as many benefits to those receiving care, will allow the Scottish Government to introduce a national wage for care staff and enter into national pay bargaining for the first time. The Scottish Government shares the ambition of the Fair Work Convention for Scotland to be a fair work nation by 2025. Emma, can you explain a little bit more about the minimum income guarantee? Is that a form of universal basic income or is it something else?
Without getting into technicalities, you can say that, yeah, definitely. Instead of saying everybody gets X amount, it's everybody must get at least X amount. It's actually, I favour it because if you're not going to means test income, what can you means test basically? And I think making sure that people have enough to live on is probably far more important than saying, right, everybody needs to have X amount, because that's going to change in a couple of months with inflation and the cost of living.
And the National Care Service has been getting sort of talked about for quite a while, not least because so much emphasis has been put on the care sector because of the pandemic. But does creating a National Care Service go beyond just about pay and benefits and conditions of work? Is it a bigger vision for how care and health work together?
Well, absolutely. I think as well as everything you've mentioned, it's about setting standards. We need to be able to say that no matter where you are in the country, you can expect a certain standard of care and you can expect these things to happen when you are in need of social care. I remember reading the Feely report a few months ago and really hoping that we were going to basically absorb it into our manifesto, and it's been fantastic for me and many others to see that we are going to do that. We are committing to looking into launching a national care service.
It's all very well, isn't it, Julie, when people talk about 4-day working week and fair work and accreditation for living hours and minimum incomes and all the rest of it. If you're an employed person, if you're self-employed or a freelance person or someone like yourself who maybe has a real variety of sometimes a paid contract, sometimes not, what does it do for you? Do you feel kind of left out of this? Because as you say, your industry, the theatre industry, is the one that's really suffered. So although big venues have been given money, individuals really haven't. So how do you feel about this? Are you included in this?
It's a funny one actually. I, as part of the Actors Union Equity, I've been at a couple of STC women's conferences and things, and it was really interesting at the last one because we had a big. There was a motion. A lot of the chat was on a universal credit and about poverty and about fairness. Actually, it really chimes in with what's happening. But there were so many people who didn't realise the situation that we were in as self-employed, because we used to have a sort of funny old status, Maggie. We had a thing called Schedule D when I first graduated about 3,000 years ago. And that was something that you were sometimes an employed earner, you were sometimes self-employed. But now we're all completely self-employed. So the universal credit thing doesn't work very well for us. And quite often, I know when these things will come out, even people who are SNP voters and things, they will look, how does this affect me? Because the Scottish Government have been more kind to our industry, I think, than Westminster. I've spoken about that at conferences as well. The first to come in with a sort of package, and for the newly self-employed, that was a real lifesaver. But there's still people who have slipped through the cracks, and I think there are still people who will continue to slip through the cracks. My big tub that I thump is UBI, so I am very, very interested in this minimum income. But we'll see. The self-employed have had a bit of a rough ride this time, and when painters and decorators and builders and all that, they get to go back. We're not back yet. There's more recorded media happening, but the bulk of our industry is not back yet. So I think we do feel a wee bit left out, actually.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I mean, and I think, am I right in saying that no theatres in Scotland have opened at all during the pandemic, whereas in England, theatres were open for a short time. I had tickets to go to the Royal Opera House at Christmas, and obviously I didn't get to go to London at Christmas, and I didn't get to go to the Royal Opera House. And although the tickets were twice as expensive because there were only half as many of us allowed in the theatre, my goodness, I was looking forward to that. So am I right in saying that the theatres have not opened at all in Scotland?
No, not to the public at all. And I actually think it was the right decision to make across the board, because there have been quite tragic consequences, actually, of a few shows happening down south, cases of COVID that resulted in, the worst eventuality, shall we say. But I think the theatres have all kind of reacted to it in a similar way. A lot of things have gone online, there have been wee films made, the things, but there's been no audiences in. And we're just an industry that we need bums on seats, and we need a lot of bums on seats. So until the social distancing is over, we're not going to see it return to its full glory, shall we say.
Well, return it will, I'm sure. But we should also remember that theatres are always the one that suffers. In the plague days, it was the theatres that were closed. So, plus ça change. In our Drossen today, the Scottish Greens pledged to end the competitive bidding process and recategorise inter-island ferries as publicly owned Scottish national infrastructure delivered by Transport Scotland and CalMac. These would work together to replace the current ageing diesel fleet with electric or hydrogen ferries, such as used in Scandinavia, to develop reliable, efficient and zero-carbon ferries. Commenting, Scottish Green co-leader Patrick Harvie said, as well as opening up new ferry links to Europe, the Scottish Greens recognise that ferries also provide vital lifeline services between our islands. Mr Harvie went on to say that there is a need to ensure these services are adequately resourced and run for communities, and despite having a publicly owned operator, it is held back by having to bid for the contract every 6 years at great expense. Without that tendering process, Government and CalMac could take a more strategic, long-term approach to upgrading the fleet to lower emissions and tackle the climate energy. But Emma, isn't there a danger that if you don't ask people to tender, you can't be sure you're getting value for money for the public purse?
Well, absolutely, and I think this is one of these cases where with the SNP you kind of get two for one. Because I attended our manifesto launch last week, and I was excited to see that we've actually committed to 30% of state-owned ferries being low emission by 2032. And that shows that with us, you get a party that will stand up for Scotland. A vote for us is recognised across the UK and the world as a vote for independence. And you also get green policies which are realistic and come from a party which is used to governing.
But what about if you're not going to? So if the Greens got their way and publicly owned ferries didn't have to tender every so often, how could you be sure that you're constantly getting good value for money for the public purse?
Well, you can't, is the short answer.
So you wouldn't, so the SNP wouldn't support that move.
Not as far as I know.
Okay, and it's interesting that they mentioned, I think last week, the idea of ferries to Europe from Rosyth again, but that did exist, that route, and it failed. And I'm assuming it failed because it wasn't competitive. So has the SNP considered any extension of ferry routes to Europe from Scotland?
Well, it's interesting because, as you say, a lot of this is based on which routes are. Sorry, I can hear another voice here.
No, sorry. No, carry on. It's these technology gremlins. Sorry. So Emma, you were saying about
Oh, me,
yeah.
sorry. Yes. No, it's a lot of it is based on what is a competitive route, whereas, we recognise that in terms of particularly the islands, that the ferries are a lifeline service, and it doesn't need to necessarily be about competitiveness. It's about serving these communities well.
Yeah. The idea of tendering, I, in my day job, work in the third sector, and I must admit, I get a bit fed up constantly having to tender for money to do a job that we do really well. And I guess it's kind of the same in the arts sector. So how do you think that would work, Julia? Suddenly you didn't have to tender for any public money. Once you got it, you just got it, keep it forever and ever. Would that mean it was difficult for new players to enter the industry? That wouldn't be fair, would it?
It definitely wouldn't be fair. I mean, I work very much in the commercial sector of the arts, big sort of comedy touring shows and things. But I have worked for funded companies as well. But what you find, Maggie, is that people, when they're in receipt of core funding, can, I hate to say this, but they can rest on their laurels a wee bit, and they can get kind of used to being in that lovely, comfortable position. That when it got when the funding, there was a around, I think it was like 3 years ago, and a few core companies got their funding cut, and oh my goodness, I mean, there was an outcry, and I think there has to be fairness in the allocation of money, and there's always someone who's going to think it's not fair because they didn't get their particular bid. But I do think that you have to sometimes think, well, I've had a good few years out of this, and maybe it's good to throw the chips up in the air and see where they land. Sometimes it might produce some real good creativity.
Yeah, well, look, we would hope. The SNP have challenged Scottish Labour leader Anas Sarwar to explain why he refuses to respect Scottish democracy while his Welsh counterpart supports his country's democratic right to choose independence. Welsh Labour leader and current First Minister Drakeford has said his party would support holding a referendum if pro-independence Plaid Cymru win a Welsh Parliament election. Plaid Cymru is committed to holding a referendum by 2026 if the party forms the next government in Cardiff Bay. Mr Drakeford told BBC Radio 4's Today programme, "I've always believed that if a party won an election in Wales with a referendum on independence in its manifesto, then it would have won the right to hold such a referendum." The SNP says Anas Sarwar's disgraceful denial of democracy is increasingly out of touch with the views of even his own party, as polling reveals a clear majority of 60% of UK Labour members support a referendum on Scottish independence in the next few years. And the Scottish Trade Unions Congress, the voice of 500,000 trade unionists, have also backed IndyRef 2 after the controversial Internal Market Bill power grab was passed in Westminster against Holyrood's wishes, saying it makes the case for a second independence referendum unanswerable. SNP Deputy Leader Keith Brown said Anas Sarwar calls Boris Johnson a disaster, but continues to deny the democratic wishes of the people of Scotland to avoid the decisions made by Boris Johnson. That is a disgrace, and confirms what respected pollster John Curtis has said, that a vote for Labour is simply a vote to allow Boris Johnson and his cronies to continue inflicting damaging policies on Scotland, policies we have consistently rejected. Julie, you can't really compare the Welsh position with the Scottish position. You can't really compare what Drakeford is saying because he knows absolutely full well there's not a chance that Plaid Cymru are going to form the government. So it's a bit like the Liberal Democrats. They can say anything they want in their manifesto. They're never going to be in power. It doesn't really matter. So is that not a bit cheeky of the SNP to try and kind of score a political point out of that?
Well, I think that's politics, isn't it? And I think that I would expect them to score that particular point because Sarwar's been very, very vocal about, yeah, Boris is a disaster, but I've not seen any actions that would demonstrate to me that he genuinely thinks he's a disaster. I mean, obviously, we're in the position of, like every other household in Scotland, you're getting the election leaflets through the door. Last week, massive Conservative one, how to stop a second Indie Ref. This morning, Labour, and it's the first we've seen from Labour actually, but this morning, Labour, how to stop a second Indie Ref. And I think, I was listening to the radio when I was out today, and I think it's actually ridiculous to think about stopping it. A party that have gone about achieving their goals in a legitimate and peaceful way. I think it's just unfair and unthinkable, and I think they're right to call them out on it.
Emma, when Monica Lennon was standing for the Labour leadership, she made it clear that she would support a referendum if the vote fell in the right way. Do you think that's one of the reasons she didn't get the leadership?
I think there's a lot more to that question than a yes or no, because as Keith Brown had said, the Labour leadership is out of touch with the party, and it's been out of touch with the party for years, and that's why they've seen a total collapse in Scotland, losing 40 MPs in 2015 and then 14 seats in 2016. I've campaigned in the SNP alongside countless Labour members, and you hear a lot of the time that my party I didn't leave my party left me, and that's absolutely tangible with Scottish Labour. You can map it out in the seats they've lost and the members they've lost. So I don't think it's necessarily that the membership as it stood maybe 5 years ago would have been against Monica Lennon, but the fact that they've lost so many people who were naturally Labour but have had to leave because of the really tough stance on the Constitution means that they're more likely to end up keeping on getting stuck in this dead end.
So the Conservative manifesto came out this week, and number one priority, as Julie has alluded to, is stop the independence referendum. I mean, that's really all their manifesto is about. When Sarwar was invited by Douglas Ross to kind of join with him in that little twosome again, better together, Anna Sarwar told him to grow up. So are you saying that in fact Labour are still campaigning on that stop the referendum rather than their own policies?
I think Labour are struggling to figure out exactly what it is that they want to do. I hear a lot of the time people say to me, all politicians are the same, and that hurts to hear as a politician, but if you're looking at it through the lens of the two-party system in Westminster, I can absolutely see why people would think that when they're looking at Labour and the Conservatives.
Yeah. Oh, no, the answer's soon enough. A bomb has been found under the car of a female police officer in Northern Ireland, in what the Northern Ireland Secretary Brandon Lewis has described as an attempted murder. The Police Service of Northern Ireland confirmed a viable explosive device had been planted beneath the car and had been found on Monday evening. We are treating this as an attack on a member of staff who also serves her community as a part-time officer, the statement said. The device was found outside her home in a rural area close to Dungiven in County Derry. There was no immediate claim of responsibility for the attack, and the police did not speculate on who was responsible. Police have come under attack in recent weeks, with violence breaking out on the streets of Belfast, Derry and other towns. The Brexit deal, which has involved checks on goods going into Northern Ireland from Great Britain, has been blamed as a contributing factor to rising tensions among loyalist communities. This, Emma, is a dark day indeed. I mean, this is a really very serious turn of events. We've seen the violence on the streets in Belfast, but planting a bomb, which apparently was also attached to a container of flammable liquid. So in fact, it would have caused a firestorm, not just a bomb aimed at the police officer and her daughter. Is a really nasty turn. Now, there's no one has claimed responsibility, although some of the police have speculated it might be the real IRA, but they don't know. Are you concerned that we really are going to see the return to that kind of targeted violence of the police that so marked the Troubles?
I think we deny the possibility at our own risk. I mean, it's unthinkable to me. I heard that the bomb was placed just where her kid would have sat, and it's it's just horrendous to think about. But I've seen also a lot of comment about how little coverage there's been about the recent violence, and I guess that's the danger. You know, we pretend it's in the past, we ignore it, we make it secondary to false promises on the side of a bus, and that risks the people who are trying to live there in peace. And this is happening. This is the sixth or seventh day of riots in Belfast now. People are genuinely at risk, and we cannot ignore it.
And Julie, this week in particular, tensions are running high because it marks the centenary of the creation of the state of Northern Ireland, which of course has split the communities even further. Um, uh, what did you think? I was very impressed by the unilateral condemnation across all parties of this, and obviously no one couldn't not say that. But it's interesting that the particular comments by Deputy First Minister and Sinn Féin Vice President Michelle O'Neill, there was a time when Sinn Féin wouldn't have denounced that kind of attack on members of the police service of Northern Ireland. And it comes within days of Sinn Féin President Mary Lou MacDonald actually apologising for the murder of Lord Mountbatten, which is something I never thought we'd say. So it feels like the politicians really are now out of step with some of their own supporters, or not necessarily supporters, but the community. So what can politicians do to reclaim that moral high ground?
Well, I think it's, we were talking about this. My son has a lot of friends in Ireland. He made these friends at university, and their take on the whole Brexit thing has been very interesting right from the start. And we're talking young people. My son's 25, and had friends who were so upset when Brexit actually was voted through and the implications on it. And we were talking about this item today. I was saying, my goodness. And I think that what these people who've perpetrated this act need to remember is that the times have changed. We've got a president in America now who is going to have something to say about all of this as well, with his Irish connections. And really, what saw us through the Troubles, because I'm a lot older than Emma. I do actually remember. I grew up in Ayrshire. And I remember people having to leave Northern Ireland, and because of it. And I think that the politicians, politics was what got us through. When Sinn Féin, I wonder what would happen if Sinn Féin took their seats in Westminster. I really do. But Emma would be able to answer this question a lot better than I can. I can only sort of conjecture in dramatic terms, but I think things have changed so much. I hope things have changed so much that we wouldn't let this happen. Westminster won't want to throw troops into Northern Ireland again. So I really hope that we're not going to go back to those horrible days of the 70s.
I don't think we can take anything for granted, whether Westminster would or not, to be absolutely honest. I mean, in some ways, it looks like the Tories are quite willing to throw the north of Ireland under the bus. And interesting, you mentioned Biden. I mean, he's been really very forcible with the UK government and saying, you don't honour the Good Friday Agreement, you don't honour the Brexit withdrawal agreement, you can kiss your trade agreement with America goodbye or way to the back of the queue. And just this week, that kind of aggressive stance, if you like, towards the UK over their treatment of the withdrawal agreement has been replicated by Angela Merkel. Germany has today urged the UK government to adhere to the entire Brexit divorce agreement after the European Union started legal action over London's unilateral actions in Northern Ireland. It remains crucial that all parts of the withdrawal agreement are fully implemented, including the protocol on Northern Ireland, German Europe Minister Michael Roth said ahead of a meeting with his EU counterparts. The rules agreed in the protocol are key to preserving the achievements of the peace process in Northern Ireland, he told reporters. Now we need to agree on a binding timeline for the full implementation of the protocol, Roth said. So, Emma, everyone was warning the UK government that if they didn't get Ireland right, it would affect the peace process. And we can't deny that anymore because we can see it happening. And yet, just this week, in fact, today, I think, Boris Johnson has pledged, in the way that only Boris Johnson can pledge, to end the ludicrous barriers to internal trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland that were created by the EU withdrawal agreement, and he has threatened again, if necessary, to invoke Article 16. So, what can Europe do about that? What will Europe be prepared to do about that? What do you think?
Well, I don't know what Europe is prepared to do, but I certainly can't fault them for taking the stance that they said to us that they were going to take years ago. I think going back, because this ties in really well with the previous item, it's not only actions from the UK government at this point that are going to increase threats and increase tensions, but words are really important at this point as well. And I'm not that reassured by the ones that Boris Johnson's coming out with.
So you think that his rhetoric is ramping up the situation and turning up the heat on what is already a pretty febrile atmosphere? Several loyalist paramilitary groups have already withdrawn support for the Good Friday Agreement within the last couple of weeks. So is this situation of Boris Johnson's making?
I think there's been a serious lack of consideration and probably a lack of acknowledgement of just how serious it still is and how important these matters still are to people over the water. And absolutely that kind of ignorance of feeling is going to cause people to get more angry.
I'm sure the security forces in the north of Ireland must have thought the days of looking under their cars were long behind them, but it really feels that it might. And like Julie, I'm old enough to remember the Troubles vividly, and I'm horrified at the thought that this kind of disgustingly sick violence could start up again. Turning our attention now to overseas, jurors today met for a second day of deliberations in the trial of Derek Chauvin, the former Minneapolis police officer charged with murder and manslaughter after kneeling on the neck of a dying George Floyd during an arrest last May. The 12 sequestered jurors are considering 3 weeks of testimony from 45 witnesses, including bystanders, police officials, medical experts, along with hours of video evidence that make up the most high-profile US case involving accusations of police misconduct in decades. Chauvin has pleaded not guilty to second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree depraved mind murder, and second-degree manslaughter. The jury began its deliberations on Monday after listening to closing arguments for most of the day. Jurors must reach a unanimous verdict on each charge to convict or acquit. A single holdout would result in a mistrial, although the state could then try Chauvin again. The case hinges on whether the jury believes the prosecution argument that Chauvin used excessive and therefore illegal force that killed Floyd. The defence has claimed that Chauvin behaved as a reasonable police officer and sought to raise doubts about the cause of Floyd's death, suggesting that heart disease or even the exhaust fumes from the nearby police car may have been factors. The jury is comprised of 4 white women, 2 white men, 3 black men, 1 black woman, and 2 multiracial women, according to court records. The court has promised to shield their identities until some time after they give their verdict. Julie, what do you think the jury are going to come back with?
I think they have to get this right. I mean, they really do. Who would be in their shoes at this moment? I hope they return a guilty verdict, because this 9 minutes, with a knee in somebody's neck, is excessive force. I really do hope that they come back with a guilty verdict. It's too important. I mean, it has reverberated around the world. This case. Yeah,
And it has thrown a lot of light on previous cases. This, as you say,
yeah,
high profile, but not the first time. I mean, they've just a few days ago, 13-year-old killed by a policeman. The guy who was stopped because he had dangling air fresheners from his car and shot by a
yeah,
policewoman who thought she was going for a taser. She's a trainer.
yeah,
She trains people how to use tasers and guns. She couldn't
yeah.
get it right. But even that, historical cases. So, it's not, obviously, sadly, it's not a one-off. Did you agree, Emma? Do you think they will convict, or what do you think might happen?
Well, it's strange listening to it because obviously all the charges and the process that they're going through is American, and I'm not even sure how it would translate to being tried here. But I think, as you say, it's been incredible how it's gripped huge parts of the world, the Black Lives Matter movement over the last year. For me, it's really brought home how entrenched racism still is in Scotland as well. It's been important in drawing attention to Sheku Bayu and the real issues that exist here. And, how many times while looking at these issues in recent weeks have we heard that annoying guy at work or in Facebook comments detracting from it with, oh, all lives matter, and an insistence that racism isn't a thing here.
Yeah, and we ignore that kind of at our peril. I've got a horrible feeling that it will kind of be a fudge, that he might get off on the second and third degree murder charge, but he might go down for the second degree manslaughter. He will still, of course, serve time. Some justice might have been seen, and of course, the concern is, and this is an interesting thing to consider. The concern is if the verdict doesn't go the way that the black community want, there might be more violence, but juries surely can't be held to that account. They shouldn't be influenced, should be, by the fact that the mob might not approve. So in that position, Julie, what do you think is going through their mind at the moment?
Well, I think probably that thing, Maggie. They will be thinking of consequences. They'll be thinking of historical consequences as well. I don't know if you've ever seen the documentary OJ in America, and it's absolutely astounding. And I think that anybody watching that would see the process that these people are going through at the moment. And it's not just this thing that's on trial. It's not this one murder that's on trial. As you said, it highlights things that have happened in the past. So it's such a precarious thing. I used the word fudge when I was talking about it with my husband earlier on. I said, I think they'll try and fudge it some way, to prove that they were still in the right, and the police, there's validity to their actions. But it's so important. I mean, I think those people, they would be terrified, absolutely terrified to get the right decision, and also terrified of the consequences, because someone's not going to be pleased whatever they decide.
And it does seem almost unfair that such a weight of history and consequence lies on the shoulders of those 12 men and women. Hey, it makes stuff a good drama, that's for sure. I don't know, did either of you watch any of the trial?
No.
Well, I watched quite a lot of it, and it wasn't very exciting, I have to say. It was no Perry Mason, let's be honest. It was no 12 Angry Men either. Like most legal trials, it's a lot of process, and it's quite dull. But I was very struck by the evidence of some of the defence witnesses who felt that they were somehow guilty. They hadn't done enough to protect George Floyd. One said that they sort of cried themselves to sleep every night thinking they could have done more. They were on the scene. And so there's that. The impact has gone way deep into the community. And, well, goodness knows how they'll get over this. The community, goodness knows how the police will get over this, depending on which way the verdict goes. And, of course, sadly, as we know, Guns are a major feature in the United States. And last week there was the Indianapolis FedEx shooting. The gunman who killed 8 workers at an Indianapolis FedEx facility appeared to browse white supremacist websites about a year before the attack, police have said. The attacker, Brandon Hole, also killed himself in last Thursday's attack, and 4 of his victims were members of the Sikh religious community. In March 2020, Hole's family asked police to intervene when he purchased a gun and threatened to commit suicide. "I'm going to point this unloaded gun at the police and they will shoot me," he told his mother, according to Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department's incident report. When the police arrived at their home, one of the officers said he had noticed that Hole had white supremacist websites opened on his computer. The police report said an officer clearing the upstairs and securing the shotgun observed what, through his training and experience, indicated was white supremacist websites. Police then seized Hole's gun and he was sent to a local hospital for mental health assessment. Police had said previously that Hole legally bought 2 semi-automatic rifles used during last week's shooting, months after he'd been in psychiatric detention. Authorities are continuing to investigate the incident and Hole's motivation. Emma, Joe Biden has been very strong on his desire to really crack down on gun crime in the States and to use what federal powers he can. One of the things is to try and make it harder for people who have had psychiatric conditions to be able to access handguns, which is welcome. But there's something about this story that makes me uneasy. This sense that this man, who would appear to have extremely well-developed racist tendencies, has been kind of dismissed as mentally ill, instead of saying, no, he's a racist, he's a violent racist, potentially violent racist, he's a criminal. So how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think it just shows how devastating far-right extremism is to modern society, and that we need to tackle it in all its forms. You know, it's really easy, I think, a lot of the time for us to cast it off as an American problem or one that doesn't exist here. And I think it's nice to be able to tell yourself that the internet exists in parallel to our own and doesn't really mean violence in the real world. But this risk in brushing off what appears to be casual links with white supremacy and online extremists, it really does translate into real life. It endangers lives.
And I mean, do you think it's right, Julie, that someone who has such extreme views, rather than be forced to face the what that means, can be just said, well, they're mentally unfit, they're not well, lock them up? That doesn't seem right somehow. That seems to be almost excusing racism rather than dealing with it.
Yeah, I think it's a really kind of invidious thing. I mean, we went, in my opinion, to be that racist and that potentially violently racist. I think you have to be a wee bit mentally ill. But I see where you're coming from, Maggie, in that um, it is an excuse. But I think people who have these mental health issues are ripe for exploitation from these groups on the internet. I think they have to be policed far more rigidly. I don't know how you do it, but it's like the case here with Joe Cox, the MP. I mean,
Mm.
I struggle even now to get over that, but that was a very similar thing. That guy had been accessing these far right groups and thinking these actions were absolutely the right thing to do. I think it's a double edged sword. You take these people who are vulnerable are vulnerable to be exploited. So how do you eradicate the exploitation? But yeah, they should have to face up to what they've done, the horrible thing that they've done, and not just get off with it.
Well, I'm not suggesting you end up in a mental institution that you're getting off with anything, but it's just,
Oh
I
no no
get
no no.
slightly uncomfortable with the sense that extreme behaviour like that, extreme violent behaviour, can be somehow not excused but explained away. There are just some people out there who are just really evil and pretty nasty. And obviously the police officer who saw the stuff was able to identify it as white supremacist. I can't imagine that would have been particularly difficult. I don't think you'd have to be a particularly intelligent or astute person to identify a white supremacist website. But of course, that doesn't even touch on what might be on the dark web, the stuff that, isn't easy to access unless you're really into some really dangerous stuff. What on earth should we be doing about the internet? I mean, our lives have changed completely. I mean, the people that invented the World Wide Web could have had no sense how it was going to be used. Someone once described me that going to the internet for information is a bit like going to Niagara Falls for a glass of water. So what should governments be doing about this, about policing this, that doesn't also get in the way of free speech, Emma?
It's a really interesting question that I don't think there's a properly formed answer to out there yet. But I think, first of all, we need to start looking at the data that is collected about people online, because we see that through advertising and through other forms of targeting specific clients to a website, people can find those who are more vulnerable to radicalization. They can find those who belong to certain demographics that are more likely to be taken in by some of these things. And I think tackling the information that is allowed to be kept on people, specifically protected characteristics, needs to be looked at.
SNP MPs today ramped up the pressure on the Tory government for bypassing Parliament and ploughing ahead with unlawful cuts to the aid budget in the middle of a pandemic. Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab promised to legislate for the cut, which breaks their manifesto and legal commitment to spend 0.7% of gross national income on overseas development aid. But the Tories backtracked and forced the cut through on the 1st of April without legislation or parliamentary approval. In stark contrast, the SNP said that in government in Scotland, they'd consistently committed to international development projects and support, including through a £10 million fund for international development and a £1 million humanitarian emergency fund, and have pledged to increase its aid budget by 50% if re-elected in May. Tory MP and former International Development Secretary Andrew Mitchell also echoed the SNP's concerns by highlighting the devastation the cuts to aid will cause across the world and questioning why the UK is cutting its foreign aid while virtually all of its allies are increasing their aid spending. Julie, we know that international aid helps stop radicalisation. It helps promote education programmes which can have a direct impact on that. So what do you think is behind Tory government thinking on this? Is this just an easy cut that they can make, or is it something more insidious at play?
I'm constantly banging on about it's just right wing politics, and I think a lot of it is just right wing politics. And I think we're edging further and further towards the right all the time, which I find just absolutely hideous. I think they might think it's a popular thing, because to me the whole Brexit thing, the whole shift to the right, has been very much aimed at we don't like people who are not us. And I think for the people that like that kind of thinking, they might embrace that. Oh well, we'll just keep the money for us. Well, we can use aid here at home, but it's incredibly short-sighted, I think, like a lot of right-wing politics.
Yeah, and Emma, we know that 0.7% of the budget is a tiny amount, given that we are one of the richest countries in the world. And we also know that in comparison to how much money is sent to the developing world through remittances from people who live and work here and send money home, it's a tiny amount. This just looks like another nail in the UK international reputation's coffin. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, we were told that Brexit would mean us taking our place in the world and that we could negotiate better international trade deals and grow stronger relationships. And, is this really how we're getting there? It's not surprising, though, that a government which shows a complete lack of compassion domestically would also show a complete lack of compassion abroad. I mean, what else can you say? It's also not surprising that a government that finds itself consistently in breach of human rights laws would want to cut human rights support by 80%.
Well, indeed. So they're happy to spend money to bomb the third world, just not build the third world up. The Times revealed today that the Callaghan government in the late 1970s plotted to move maritime borders to bring North Sea oil into English waters as part of a clandestine publicity and propaganda unit to counter the SNP, amid growing concern over the likelihood of an independent Scotland. These attempts to undermine Scotland and support for Scottish independence would appear to be a forerunner of the current Tory government's union unit and the power grab on the Scottish Parliament. Commenting on the story, SNP Deputy Leader Keith Brown said, "This is a timely reminder of how successive UK governments see Scotland. In the 1970s, it was Scotland's oil they set out to grab. Now it's the powers of Scotland's Parliament. There are echoes across the generations. The new union unit and legislation to take powers and funding from Scotland's Parliament are simply the modern day equivalent of trying to change the border to ensure the oil wealth could not accrue to Scotland. At any sign of Scotland becoming successful, standing on our own feet and choosing our own future, Labour and the Tories put the interests of Westminster before the people of Scotland." Of course, Emma, the maritime border has changed. In 1999, under Tory Blair, they redrew the maritime border, which under Margaret Thatcher was considerably more generous to Scotland. And it removed, I think, something like 66,000 square miles of sea and took in some of the more southerly oil fields. So there's nothing new on this. But international lawyers tell us that actually there's nothing illegal about that it's all to do with the way that sea boundaries are legislated for, and that in actual fact, England is actually entitled to taking more of Scotland waters, and that come an independence negotiation, they might push for that. So how do we stop that happening?
Well, I think first of all, when you look at political campaigns from decades ago, a lot of them look daft today, but it is quite eerie how pertinent the SNP's "It's Our Oil" posters still remain. And they were made back before we could dream of having seats in the Scottish Parliament, let alone run the Scottish government. It's probably quite telling as well, though, that decades on, unionist governments continue to resort to underhand tactics like this because they can't think of any arguments for us to stay in the union that stand up on merit.
So they're just going to steal the family silver. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think international law does suggest that the boundary should be perpendicular to the border, and I know that Richard Lochhead has asked for this to be revisited quite recently, and I completely back, and I know that the party and the SNP are entirely in favour of that as well.
But as you say, nothing really much changes. Plus ça change when it comes to the union. That's all we've got time for tonight. I want to thank both my guests for taking part. Emma Roddick and Julie Coombe, thank you very much. It just leaves me now to do my usual plea at the end of a programme. If you've enjoyed tonight, if you'd like to see Broadcasting Scotland not just continue, but to thrive and grow, then it's time to put your hand in your pocket. It takes money to make these programmes. Please go on to www.broadcastingscotland.scot/register and see how you can make a donation to help us continue to thrive. As we often say, if we had just 1% of BBC Scotland's budget, just think what we could do. Have an enjoyable evening, and I'll see you at the weekend. Thank you.